The desert has a way of keeping secrets. In the dying light of an Arizona sunset, where the saguaro cacti stand like ancient sentinels and the red earth holds the memory of 1,000 untold stories, John Mercer rode into the ruins of what was once a thriving Apache settlement. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding men like him, drifters with haunted eyes and hands that knew both the weight of a gun and the gentleness of mercy. John had been a cavalry officer once, before the things he'd seen and the orders he'd been forced to follow had hollowed him out from the inside. Now he was just a man trying to outride his ghosts, moving from town to town, taking odd jobs, never staying long enough for anyone to ask questions about the scars that lined his back or the night terrors that woke him gasping for air. He'd heard about the settlement from a shopkeeper in Tucson, a place where the last remnants of the Chiricahua Apache lived in an uneasy peace with white settlers, farming the unforgiving land and trying to hold on to what remained of their dignity. What the shopkeeper hadn't mentioned was that the settlement had been raided 3 days prior by a gang of outlaws led by a man named Cutter Doane, a monster who made his living stealing from the defenseless and destroying anything resembling hope. The devastation was complete. Adobe walls had been reduced to rubble. Crops lay trampled in the fields. And in the center of it all, sitting perfectly still among the ruins with her back straight and her eyes fixed on the horizon, was a girl who couldn't have been more than 19 years old. She didn't flinch when John's horse approached. Didn't turn her head or acknowledge his presence in any way. Her long black hair hung in a single braid down her back, and her doeskin dress, though torn and stained with dust, was arranged with a dignity that spoke of fierce pride. But it was her face that stopped John cold, not because of its beauty, though she was striking in the way desert flowers are striking, blooming against all odds, but because of the absolute absence of expression. Her dark eyes stared at nothing and everything, empty as abandoned wells. "Miss?" John dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and his voice soft. "Are you hurt?" Nothing. Not even a flicker of recognition that he'd spoken. He tried again, this time in the broken Apache he'd learned years ago from a scout named Grey Wolf, before Grey Wolf had taken a bullet meant for John and died in his arms. "I am friend. I want to help." This time her eyes moved, just slightly, tracking toward him with the wariness of a wild creature that had learned humans brought only pain. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. She tried again, and John realized with a jolt of understanding that she wasn't choosing silence, something had stolen her voice. Over the next hour, as the desert sky transformed from gold to purple to the deep indigo of coming night, John pieced together what had happened through gesture and the evidence scattered around them. The raiders had come at dawn. They'd taken everything of value, horses, food, weapons, even the silver jewelry the women had worn. The men who tried to fight were killed. The others had fled into the desert or been taken. And this girl, whose name he learned through carefully drawn symbols in the dust was Ayana, meaning, eternal blossom, had been left behind because Doane's men believed she was cursed. A girl who couldn't scream couldn't be properly terrorized, and what was the fun in that? But there was something else, something she couldn't quite communicate through gestures alone. As the moon rose, a silver disk so bright it cast shadows, Ayana finally took John's offered canteen and drank. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and touched his hand, just the briefest contact, and jerked back as if burned. Her eyes, previously so empty, suddenly brimmed with something that might have been fear or might have been wonder. She picked up a stick and began to write in English, the letters shaky but determined, "You are the first." John frowned. The first what? She wrote more slowly this time, and he had to lean close to read the words in the moonlight. "No man has ever touched me before. They say I am cursed. They say my silence is a punishment from the spirits. Even my own father would not hold me as a child. When I reached for him, he turned away." The words hit John like a physical blow. He thought of all the times he'd been touched, by his mother's gentle hands smoothing his hair, by his father's firm grip on his shoulder, by his wife Sarah before the fever took her, by his daughter Emma who'd climbed into his lap every evening to hear stories. He thought of how touch was the first language humans learned, the way we confirmed we weren't alone in the world. And this girl, This young woman who'd survived a massacre, who'd watched her world burn, had never known even that basic human comfort. "That's not right," he said quietly, knowing she couldn't hear the roughness in his voice but hoping she could see the conviction in his eyes. "That's not right at all." She wrote again, "When your hand touched mine, I felt warmth. Not the warmth of the sun or fire. Different. Alive. It frightened me. But also, I wanted more." John made a decision then, the kind of decision that changes the trajectory of a life. He'd been running for 3 years, trying to escape the weight of all the people he'd failed to save. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to save just one person, even if that person couldn't ask for saving. "Miss Ayanna," he said, settling down to sit cross-legged in the dust across from her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'd like to help you find your people. And if we can't find them, I'd like to help you build a new life. You're not cursed. You're not broken. You're a survivor, and survivors are the strongest people I know." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for the lie, for the trick, for the betrayal that experience had taught her must be coming. But John had 3 years of grief carved into the lines around his eyes, and grief knows its own kind. What she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded once, sharp and decisive. Then she did something that would stay with John for the rest of his life. She reached across the space between them and placed her hand, palm down, on top of his. Not grabbing, not clutching, just resting there with the tentative trust of someone testing whether the ice will hold their weight. Her hand was small and calloused and trembling slightly, and John held perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter this fragile moment. They sat like that under the desert moon, two broken people finding something neither had expected to find, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to be whole again. The next morning, John and Ayanna began a journey that would take them across some of the harshest territory in the Arizona desert, but the physical journey was nothing compared to the internal landscape they'd have to cross. John knew that finding Ayanna's scattered people, if any had survived, would take time, resources, and luck. What he didn't know was that in helping her, he would find the redemption he'd stopped believing he deserved. They traveled slowly, rationing the water and supplies John had in his saddlebags. He'd expected the silence between them to be awkward, but instead he found it strangely peaceful. Ayanna communicated through a combination of gestures, drawings in the sand, and increasingly confident written words. She was, he discovered, remarkably intelligent and observant, with a dry sense of humor that emerged in the wry slant of her eyebrows when he did something she found amusing. On the third day, they reached a small town called Redemption Ridge, a name John found grimly appropriate. The town was rough around the edges, the kind of place where strangers were viewed with suspicion and Apache heritage could get you refused service or worse. But John had saved the sheriff's brother during the war, and old debts had a way of opening doors that would otherwise stay closed. Sheriff Tom Brennan was a bear of a man with a conscience that had somehow survived intact despite decades of frontier brutality. When John explained Ayanna's situation, Tom's weathered face creased with concern. "There's a missionary couple on the edge of town, the Hendersons," Tom said, keeping his voice low so as not to spook the girl who stood rigidly near the door, looking like she might bolt at any moment. "They've been taking in folks the raids displaced. Good people. They might know something about her family." But when they visited the Henderson mission, what they found wasn't information about Ayanna's family, it was a revelation that would change everything. Martha Henderson, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes and capable hands, took one look at Ayanna and burst into tears. "Sweet Lord above," she whispered. "I know this child. I was there the day she was born." The story that emerged was almost too painful to hear. Ayanna's mother had died in childbirth, bleeding out before the midwives could save her. In the chaos and grief, no one had noticed that the baby never cried. Not when she was born, not when she was cold, not when she was hungry. The tribal elders had declared it an ill omen. A child who couldn't cry was a child who couldn't communicate with the spirits, who stood outside the natural order. Her father, a respected warrior named Broken Arrow, had been pressured by his family and the tribal council to leave the child exposed to the elements. It was Martha, visiting the settlement as a young missionary, who'd interceded. She'd convinced Broken Arrow to let the child live, arguing that all life was precious in God's eyes. But the damage was done. Ayanna had grown up touched only when necessary, fed and clothed but never embraced, spoken to but never answered with anything but gestures and glances. She'd learned to write English at Martha's insistence, attending the mission school where she'd been the brightest student, but her own people had never fully accepted her. And now, after the raid, Broken Arrow was among the dead. Ayanna was truly alone. "That's not true," John said quietly, and everyone in the room turned to look at him. "She's not alone." Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened in Redemption Ridge. John took a job at the livery stable to earn money for supplies. Ayanna stayed at the mission, helping Martha with the younger children who'd been orphaned by various raids and tragedies. And slowly, cautiously, the townspeople began to notice something. They noticed how the children, who'd been traumatized into silence by their own experiences, seemed drawn to Ayanna. How she'd sit with them and communicate in the language of gesture and expression that words couldn't capture. How a child who hadn't spoken in months would start to laugh again after spending time with the girl who'd never had a voice at all. They noticed how John, the taciturn drifter who'd arrived in town like a ghost, seemed to come alive in Ayanna's presence. How he'd learned her system of signs and gestures with the dedication of a scholar learning a sacred text. How he'd taught her to ride his horse, standing close enough to catch her if she fell but never touching without permission, always asking with his eyes first. And they noticed how Ayanna herself was transforming. The empty-eyed girl who'd arrived looking more dead than alive began to bloom in truth, living up to her name. Color returned to her cheeks. Her movements became more fluid, less guarded. And her face, which had been a beautiful mask hiding nothing because it showed nothing, became expressive in ways that were almost musical, emotions flowing across her features like water. The turning point came on a Sunday evening when Martha was teaching a group of women to sew. Ayanna was there, her skilled fingers making short work of a complex embroidery pattern, when one of the other women, a sharp-tongued widow named Agnes Pritchard who'd never made secret her disdain for Indians and half-breeds, spoke up. "I still say it's not natural, a girl who can't talk. How's she going to find a husband? Who's going to want damaged goods?" The room went silent. Every woman there turned to look at Agnes with varying degrees of shock and disapproval, but before Martha could formulate a sufficiently withering response, John's voice came from the doorway. "I would." Every head swiveled toward him. John stood there in his dusty work clothes, hat in hand, looking at Ayanna with an expression that made several of the women catch their breath. It wasn't desire, though there was affection there. It wasn't pity, though there was protectiveness. It was something deeper and more profound, it was recognition. Two souls seeing each other completely and choosing, despite all their damage and all their scars, to try. Ayanna rose slowly from her seat. She walked across the room with measured steps until she stood directly in front of John. Then she did something she'd never done before. She reached up and placed both her hands on either side of his face, looking into his eyes with an intensity that seemed to pour all the words she'd never been able to speak into that single gesture. John raised his own hands and, with infinite gentleness, covered hers. "If you'll have me," he said softly. "Not because you need saving. Not because you need someone to speak for you. But because I think we could be happy together. Because I think we could heal together." Tears rolled down Ayanna's cheeks, the first tears anyone had ever seen her shed. She nodded, once, then twice, and then she was in his arms and he was holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world, which to him, she was. The wedding took place a month later, under a desert sky so vast and star-filled it seemed to hold infinite possibilities. The whole town turned out, even Agnes Pritchard, who had the grace to look ashamed of herself. But the most remarkable moment came at the end of the ceremony, when Martha Henderson sang a hymn about grace and redemption. As her voice filled the evening air, people noticed that Ayana's mouth was moving, shaping the words she couldn't produce, and John, standing beside her with their hands clasped, was singing for both of them, his rough voice carrying the melody while his eyes never left his bride's face. Later, as the celebration wound down and the moon rose over the desert, that same silver moon that had witnessed their first meeting, John and Ayana sat together on the porch of their small house. She had her slate and chalk, and she wrote, "I was wrong. I am not cursed." John read it and smiled. "No, you're not. You never were." She wrote again, "My father turned away because he could not bear to hear me cry. But he was wrong too. I was not silent because I was cursed. I was silent because I was listening. To the wind. To the earth. To the language underneath language. And when you touched me that first night, I heard something new. Your heartbeat. It told me I was not alone." John's eyes burned with unshed tears. "You'll never be alone again. I promise you that." She nodded and leaned against him, and they sat in comfortable silence as the desert breathed around them. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, building a life together, facing the prejudices that would come, finding ways to communicate the depth of their bond to a world that often valued sound over substance. But tonight, under the desert moon, two people who'd been told they were broken had found in each other proof that wholeness wasn't about being perfect. It was about being seen, being touched, being chosen. And somewhere in the vast Arizona night, the spirits that Ayana's people believed she couldn't communicate with smiled down on the girl with no voice who'd found her voice in the steady, faithful love of a man who'd learned that redemption wasn't about forgetting your sins, it was about learning to live in a way that honored those you couldn't save by saving those you could. The desert, which had seen so much cruelty and violence, held this small miracle close, the miracle of two people proving that the deepest human connection requires no words at all, only the courage to reach out, to touch, and to hold on when everything says you should let go. In the end, Ayana